Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Today we're doing our final video on all of the spell changes in the 2024 Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook. We started off with cantrips and first level spells, then second and third, fourth and fifth, sixth and seventh, and now we're finishing with 8th and 9th level spells. This one should be a little bit shorter of a video because there just simply aren't as many spells at these levels, but that doesn't mean that there's no shortage of changes. But before I get to that, if you are a new viewer to this channel or returning viewer and you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider hitting the subscribe button either now or at some point during this video. At the time of this recording, we are so close to 1,000 subscribers, we can almost taste it. We might hit that by the time this video comes out, so we'll see. We did. Thank you so much for everyone who has taken the time to subscribe to this channel and watch my videos and interact on the comments. I really appreciate it. If not, I think this video might push it over the top based on the number of subscribers that I get every time I release a video, but either way, all very exciting stuff. Again, I appreciate all of your guys' support so much. But yes, let's talk about the 8th and 9th level spells in Dungeons & Dragons 2024 and what has changed and what is new. I don't know if there's actually any new spells at 8th and 9th level, but let's take a look. So starting off with animal shapes, the duration of the spell no longer requires concentration, so that's pretty significant because it is a 24-hour duration spell. The transformation now uses the shapeshift keywording. This is important for spells like Moonbeam that cause creatures who are shapeshifted to go back to their normal form, or any similar such effect. The spell now specifies that which kind of beast that the affected creatures turn into is the caster's choice, whereas previously that wasn't specifically said. And it also states that you can also choose different forms for each target, whereas it previously did not say that. It is a magic action to transform the targets again, whereas previously this was just an action. And then as we've seen across other sort of polymorph type spells, the target now retains their creature type as well as their hit points, hit dice, alignment, and their ability to communicate, whereas previously they kept their alignment and their mental stats, but everything else changed. So notably, you are still humanoid even when you're turned into a beast, which means that you can't be targeted by spells that would target a beast, but you can be targeted by spells that would target a humanoid creature. And in that similar vein, you now gain temporary hit points equal to the beast's hit points instead. And then much like other polymorph spells, the transformation lasts until the temporary hit points are removed. However, that doesn't end the duration of the spell. It just ends that transformation on you. So the person who cast the wild shape spell during that duration can still use another magic action to transform you into a beast again. Additionally, affected creatures are also able to untransform themselves using a bonus action. However, they cannot retransform themselves once they do that. They would need the caster to use the magic action to put them back in a beast form. Moving on to Anti-Magic Field. This is now an emanation, which is no mechanical change. It was always an emanation technically. They're just now using that keywording. This also now prevents magic actions, and the pinch of powdered iron was removed from the material component options. If you remember or even looked at recently the Anti-Magic Field spell description from 2014, the format of the spell is actually very, very different. It was a much longer spell in 2014. Basically all the same effects of Anti-Magic Field in 2014 still exist in 2024. They just added the addition of you can't take magic actions. And that is actually pretty significant because that would also specifically prevent you from using certain class features that are magical in nature that require the magic action to use. And also now because that you can't take magic actions, that also prevents you from accidentally wasting one of those actions by using it within an anti-magic field, because you can't even take that action in the first place. It's not that you do it and then it has no effect because you're in that field. It's that you can't take that action in the first place. Moving on to antipathy and sympathy. You can now target a huge or smaller object, whereas previously it said a huge or smaller object that fits in a 200-foot square. The kind of creature chosen by the spell no longer needs to be intelligent, so to speak. The range of the ongoing effect of the spell was increased to 120 feet from 60 feet. So they don't call it an emanation here, but it is effectively an emanation around that creature or object. I forgot to write it down here in the description, but the 2014 version of the antipathy effect said that if the creature breaks line of sight with the affected creature, the source of the fear, that the frightened condition was suppressed. But it no longer says that. Additionally, the sympathy effect now imposes the charmed condition, whereas it didn't do that before. Also, affected creatures can no longer repeat the initial saving throw every 24 hours. The only way to end the effect is to be more than 120 feet away from the target, which is going to be difficult for sympathy affected creatures because they're compelled to move towards the target and be as close to it as possible, whereas people who are affected by the frightened condition will be running away from it. So they have the possibility of removing the effect from themselves. And then finally, the material component was changed to a mix of vinegar and honey. Moving on to the clone spell, the 1 cubic inch of flesh was removed from material components and is now an optional part of casting the spell. It says you touch a creature or at least 1 cubic inch of its flesh. Previously, you needed 1 cubic inch of their flesh as part of the material component, but that is no longer required. So if you're creating a clone of yourself, you can just basically put your hand on your chest or whatever and create a duplicate of yourself in the vessel that it's being kept in. The spell description no longer states that the clone reaches, quote unquote, full maturity after 120 days. It just says that it stops growing then. I don't know if they thought that was redundant with, you know, finishes growing, but in my head it was just kind of funny because, oh, if you were super immature before you created your clone and then you died and then your clone came to life, then you'd be a lot more mature afterwards and be so serious or whatever. That's probably not why they made that change. It's probably just, they probably just thought it was redundant with finishes growing, but just wanted to point that out. For control weather, it now ends early if you go indoors, whereas previously this said if you didn't have a clear path to the sky. So even if you just have like a physical object over your head, technically that could end the control weather spell, which is a little weird. Indoors makes a lot more sense. There are no changes to the precipitation effects that you can possibly have. For the temperature effects, the stage 1 of temperature is now called a heat wave, whereas previously this was called bearable heat. The final stage of the temperature is now called freezing, whereas previously this was called arctic cold. Don't know if that has any real implications, but I just wanted to point out the word change there. And then finally, while there are no changes to the wind conditions, the material component had the bits of earth and wood mixed with water removed from the material components. It is now just burning incense. For the demiplane spell, it now specifies that the door can be opened and closed, whereas previously this was a little unclear if the door was opened when the spell manifests. Whether or not the demiplane is made of wood or stone is now specifically the caster's choice, whereas that wasn't so explicit before. And additionally, they kind of nerfed it a little bit here, where it says creatures inside the demiplane, when the spell ends, can now choose to be shunted outside of the demiplane and land prone in the nearest unoccupied space where the door was. I'm a little disappointed in this. I mean, I've never used a demiplane in this way, but as a way that you could use demiplane, where a spellcaster could just open a demiplane and then like your barbarian could grab a creature, throw them in the demiplane, and then you could dismiss the spell and basically banish them that way. You know, that was always an effective demiplane that I had in my head, that if I ever had the spell, I might have tried to do something like that. That wouldn't necessarily be the reason I take demiplane, but between this change and the removal of the banishment effect of plane shift, I'm feeling a little targeted by these spell changes because they're kind of taking these niche uses of those spells away from me. Moving on to Dominate Monster, much like all the other Dominate effects, it no longer says that you can use an action to take precise control of the target. You can just issue them general commands like you always could. For the Earthquake spell, this was changed to Transmutation from Evocation. Breaking concentration of affected creatures is now tied to the Dexterity saving throw to avoid falling prone. I think this makes sense for the Earthquake spell. I don't think it makes sense for the Sleet Storm spell, which had a similar change, where if creatures fall prone on the ice, that breaks their concentration, whereas if they're flying in the air, they're apparently not affected by the winds and rain of the Sleet Storm. So in my opinion, I would still rule that Sleet Storm would affect flying creatures, but it makes sense that Earthquake necessarily doesn't. The spell description no longer suggests that the spell might have other effects depending on the terrain as determined by the DM. Of course, they can still determine other effects that could happen depending on the terrain, but that is no longer suggested by the spell. For the fissures feature of the spell, the caster now chooses the fissure locations, whereas they didn't before. However, the fissures can now no longer be placed under structures. For the structures subsection of the spell, the structures now take damage at the end of your turns, whereas previously this was at the start of your turns. The spell also no longer suggests that the save DC to avoid structural collapse can be adjusted based on like the material that the structure is made out of. You know, like a simple log cabin might not have the same save DC as a concrete tower or something like that. Finally, the material component was changed to a fractured rock. And one thing worth noting for the structures feature of this spell, because of the way that they changed the timing that it deals damage at the end of your turn, as well as when you cast the spell, that means that structures in the area would basically take 100 bludgeoning damage the turn that you cast the spell, because it takes 50 bludgeoning damage immediately when you cast it, and then when your turn ends, it's going to take 50 bludgeoning damage again, and then every subsequent turn, it'll just take the 50 damage at the end of your turn. But the first turn you cast it, unlike in 2014, it's going to take 100 damage, it's going to take 50 damage twice. That could potentially collapse a lot of structures in the area the first turn that it happens. Moving on to Befuddlement, this was now renamed from Feeble Mind. So the Feeble Mind spell no longer kind of exists, but it's now called Befuddlement, and it works a little bit differently, although it's mostly the same. Damage only happens on a failed save, and that damage was increased to 10d12, whereas previously the damage happened immediately when you cast the spell, but the damage was only 4d6. So it does a lot more damage now, but it is no longer guaranteed damage. Additionally, the Intelligence and Charisma scores are no longer affected. The creature can still speak and understand language, whereas previously they were unable to do either of those things. Unlike in 2014, the creature can no longer take magic actions, whereas previously it just said that they are unable to activate magic items, and the material component was changed to a key ring with no keys. The effects of the spell are still very similar. It's still going to basically shut down any spellcaster. However, it's a lot more player friendly, as they're still able to speak and understand language, and their ability scores aren't affected, so they don't need to try to roleplay being like having an intelligence of 1 or 2 or whatever it was. And because you're unable to take magic actions, it can potentially be a lot worse in a lot of ways, because that prevents you from using a lot of class features that require magic actions now, not just locking you out of spells. However, because it no longer says that it prevents the use of magic items, if the magic item doesn't require a magic action to use, then you could still potentially use that magic item while affected by the spell. It is not a specific function of the magic action that you use that action when you activate a magic item. You only use magic actions to activate magic items that require a magic action to use. So there may still be some magic items that you could use under the effects of the spell. And one thing worth noting that is the same as it was in 2014, but has different implications in 2024. The sentence here that says at the end of every 30 days, the target repeats the save, ending the effective on itself in a success. Because it specifically says the saving throw, not like another saving throw or anything along those lines, it is self-referential, so it's referring to the saving throw of this spell, where if you fail the save, you take 10d12 psychic damage. So every 30 days, if you fail the save, you take an additional 10d12 psychic damage and, continuously affected by the spell. So that is worth noting as well. Moving on to glibness, the school was changed to enchantment from transmutation, otherwise it's unchanged. Holy Aura is now an emanation, which is no mechanical change, they're just using that keywording. Creatures of your choice within the radius at the time of casting no longer shed a dim light in a 5-foot radius, and the reliquary in the material component no longer needs to contain a sacred relic. For Incendiary Cloud, the strength of the wind is no longer defined as at least 10 miles per hour. It just is suggested like that of gust of wind. The Incendiary Cloud no longer spreads around corners. It also now additionally affects creatures when the effect moves into that creature space, in addition to creatures entering its space or ending their turn there. And much like other similar ongoing effects, the saving throw can only occur once per turn, whereas previously this was unlimited. Moving on to the Maze spell, it is now a study action to try to escape, whereas previously this was just an action. It is worth noting that this would now allow a character with the 2024 version of Keen Mind to attempt to escape twice on their turn, because that allows you to take the study action as a bonus action. So if you are trapped by the Maze spell but you have Keen Mind, you can use your action to attempt the study action to escape, and then if that fails, you can use your bonus action to reattempt it. The intelligence check to escape the maze now benefits from investigation proficiency, which is pretty cool. And then they kind of nerfed it for some monsters, where Minotaurs and Guristros no longer automatically succeed the check to do so. For the Mind Blank spell, this now also masks alignment, whereas it didn't do that previously. It now prevents magically detecting the affected creature's location, whereas previously this just protected from divination spells. It also specifies that no spell, even Wish, can observe the affected creature remotely, from only affecting their mind or gathering information. Moving on to Power Word Stun, this now reduces the target speed to 0 until the start of your next turn if the target has more than 150 hit points. For Sunburst, Undead and Oozes no longer have disadvantage on the saving throw. We've seen similar nerfs to other spells like Sunbeam previously. Fire was removed from the material components. And then one thing I think is interesting about this spell, at the bottom here it says, this spell dispels darkness in its area that was created by any spell. However, the Hunger of Hadar spell states that no light, magical or otherwise, can illuminate the area. That seems sort of like an unstoppable force, immovable object sort of conundrum. Now you might say that the Sunburst says it dispels the darkness, not that it illuminates the darkness. So I mean, technically you could say that Sunburst beats it that way. I think it dispels it by illuminating it. I think that is the implication of the effect. So if that would ever come up, you just kind of need to decide how you would rule that. For the Telepathy spell, this was changed to Divination from Evocation. I love to see more Divination spells, even if they're just changing the school type. And the only change here is that the target creature no longer needs to have an intelligence score of at least 1 to understand. So even if the stat block of the creature for some reason doesn't even have an intelligence score, if its intelligence score is somehow 0, it is still able to understand you. And then for the last of the 8th level spells, we have Tsunami. The only change to Tsunami is that the range is set to 1 mile, whereas previously this was Sight. So starting our 9th level spells, we're starting with Astral Projection. The duration was changed to until dispelled, whereas previously this was special. It is now a magic action to dismiss the effect on all affected targets, whereas previously this was an action. It no longer states that targets are stranded by the spell if it ends early for the caster, but I would say this is still true, because if it ends early for the caster, then it still ends early for them, according to the effects of the spell. Then the other creatures who are affected by the spell can still have the spell end on them in all the same ways that are described by the spell. Nowhere in the description here does it say if the spell ends early for the caster, then it ends for everyone, so it's still kind of the same effect. And then lastly, the silver bar in the material component no longer needs to be ornately carved. It can just be any silver bar. For the Foresight spell, this now references D20 tests, whereas previously this said attack rolls, ability checks, and saving throws. There's no real effective change here. Moving on to the Gate spell, the portal's destination is now visible through the gate, so you know where you're going, and you can't trick a creature like going into the elemental plane of fire and then closing the gate. The text about creatures being transported through the portal are now more clearly instantaneous. If you're trying to call a creature through the portal, which is one of the functions of this spell, in 2024 it says the portal opens next to a named creature and transports it to the nearest unoccupied space on your side of the portal. In 2014 it said something like the portal opens near the creature and draws it through the portal or something like that, and I think the word draw seemed to have a connotation of it taking time to do so, but that amount of time wasn't necessarily specified, so it was a little unclear how quickly that took place. But in 2024, they changed the wording so it's very clear that it's transported through the gate at the time of the casting. Moving on to Mass Heal, this was changed to the Abjuration School of Magic from Evocation. This now removes the poisoned condition, whereas previously this removed disease. And of course, we know that disease mechanics were removed in 2024. And much like all of the other healing spells in 2024, this now affects undead and constructs if you'd like them to. For the Meteor Swarm spell, this now applies the burning hazard to all non-magical objects that aren't being worn or carried within the radius. Power word Heal, this had its range increased to 60 feet from touch, so that is a pretty significant range increase. The school was changed to Enchantment from Evocation. This now also removes the poisoned condition, and it now also affects undead and construct, much like every other heal spell. Power word Kill was now changed that it deals 12d12 psychic damage if the creature affected by it has more than 100 hit points. When you cast the spell, if they have 100 hit points or less, they instantly die. If they have greater than 100 hit points, then they take 12d12 psychic damage. So there's some effect one way or the other, and I like these changes on these spells, especially these higher level spells that can only be cast really once per day. There's always something that happens, which feels very fitting for these higher level spells. For Prismatic Wall, the base text of this spell only has one small change where it says the wall now has an AC of 10. This would be necessary for destroying certain layers of the wall with certain like spell attack rolls. So the wall can no longer sort of automatically be hit. You just have to beat an AC of 10, which should be pretty easy if you're at a level where you're facing a Prismatic Wall. Moving on to the different layers of the Prismatic Wall, we're going to go through the individual changes with callouts here. So much like Prismatic Spray, the damage is increased across the board for the red, orange, yellow, green, blue colors, where it's 12d6 now instead of 10d6. The orange layer can now be destroyed by a strong wind, such as the Gust of Wind spell, and now makes that suggestion for you. A creature petrified by the Indigo Wall, and now makes the suggestion that a Greater Restoration spell is a way to remove that petrified condition. Additionally, if you want to destroy the Indigo Wall, and that specifically needs to be the Daylight spell, whereas previously this said it could be a similar spell of equal or higher level, but now it specifically needs to be the Daylight spell. And similarly, to destroy the Violet layer, it now specifically needs to be the Dispel Magic spell, whereas previously this included a similar spell of equal level or higher, but now it is specifically the Dispel Magic spell. So if you are going to put a Prismatic Wall in front of your players, and you intend for them to get past it, you should make sure that they have all these tools available to them. For the shape change spell, we're starting with it is now a magic action to change into different shapes, whereas previously this was just an action. Again, very similar to all the other polymorph spells. This now grants temporary hit points equal to the creature's temporary hit points. It ends early if you have no temporary hit points left. One actually pretty cool change in 2024 is that you can now use legendary actions of that creature, or even layer actions if you're in the layer of that creature. I don't know if it would need to be your layer or if it would need to be a layer appropriate to that creature. That's something that you would need to discuss with your DM. Legendary actions would technically be usable for sure. In 2014, the spell description specifically said you cannot use legendary actions or layer actions of that stat block, whereas now that text is not included in the text of this spell. There might be something that they call out in the monster manual. I don't know why they would put that restriction in that book specifically, but we'll have to wait and see. And again, much like any other polymorph spell, you retain your creature type, hit points, hit dice, and your ability to communicate. You also now retain the spellcasting trait, whereas this is something that you didn't retain in 2014. Additionally, your equipment now changes to the size and shape to fit each form you choose, whereas this didn't work that way in 2014. And finally, the jade circlet in the material component no longer needs to be worn when you cast the spell. For the Storm of Vengeance spell, the range was changed to 1 mile from sight, much like the Tsunami spell and the 8th level spells. The radius of the cloud was reduced to 300 feet from 360 feet. Not quite sure why they felt the need to nerf it like that. That seems like an arbitrary change, but it is what it is. Affected creatures can now be any distance under the cloud, whereas previously they had to be within 5,000 feet under the cloud. Creatures who fail the first saving throw are deafened for the duration of the spell, whereas previously this was for 5 minutes. So the spell is only a 1 minute duration. Creatures who are deafened are now affected by that for 4 minutes less effectively. The additional effects of the spell happen at the start of your turn, whereas previously this was just on your turn. The round 2 effect of the acid damage was increased to 4d6 from 1d6, and the strong winds mentioned in the turns 5 through 10 of the spell no longer explicitly affect concentration. That was previously mentioned in the description of the spell in 2014. It is not included here in 2024. Moving on to Time Stop, this one is actually unchanged. For true polymorph, there's actually quite a number of changes here. So much like other polymorph effects, it is now considered a shapeshift, so it is affected by things like Moonbeam. It now lasts until the target dies, whereas previously this was reduced to 0 hit points. So while they're making death saving throws, they still maintain the true polymorph shape, assuming that they're not the one concentrating on it. In a creature-to-creature transformation, the target keeps their hit points and hit dice. Notably, you do not keep your creature type for true polymorph. So if you turn into a dragon, you are considered a dragon. You are not still considered humanoid, unlike every other polymorph type effect in 2024. You do gain temporary hit points equal to the creature's total hit points, and the spell ends early if you have no more temporary hit points. In an object to creature transformation, the creature is considered friendly for the duration, which grants advantage on influence actions with it. It also takes its turn immediately after yours and obeys your commands, and the DM is no longer considered in charge of it. And then also in an object to creature transformation, if it lasts more than an hour, the creature is no longer under your control, whereas previously it was only if the spell becomes permanent. I mean, it's kind of the same thing because the spell becomes permanent if you maintain concentration for the whole duration, and the duration is 1 hour, but they specifically changed that wording. Moving on to True Resurrection, this no longer states that the creature's soul must be free and willing to do so, but this is now covered by the death rules in 2024. And again, I have a video all about the death rules and how they work in 2024. I'll link to that down in the description down below. Now also cures all magical contagions affecting the creature, whereas previously this said disease, because of course disease mechanics were removed in 2024. Additionally, the holy water was removed from the material components. For the weird spell, failing the initial saving throw now deals 10d10 psychic damage with a save for half, whereas previously failing the initial saving throw just didn't do any damage at all. Additionally, the repeated damage on subsequent saves was increased to 5d10 from 4d10. And then finally, moving on to the last 9th level spell, the last spell for all of these videos that we can cover, the creme de la creme, we have the Wish spell. This spell is basically exactly the same as it was in 2014. They only added one small thing to it where there is a sudden learning feature that says you can switch out one of your feats that you've learned for another feat for which you qualify. Although if that feat is a prerequisite for another feat or another feature that you have, you cannot switch out that feat, but you could switch out any other feats. And then it's sort of like a flavor addition, or for some more context for the DM. In the Reshape Reality section, it goes on to provide additional guidance for DMs about how to manage wishes that would change the world or the plane or change the cosmos in some way, but it really offers no mechanical changes to the spell. The only real change to Wish in 2024, it specifically adds a feature that allows you to switch out your feats if you wanted to. Of course, Wish still has the drawback that if you use it for anything other than duplicating a spell of 8th level or lower, that you have a 33% chance of losing the spell, in addition to having the sort of weakened state from it for a certain amount of time. But one thing I thought was interesting about being able to change your feats out specifically is that once you reach level 19, you could potentially use Wish to switch out all of your feats for epic boons, because when you replace a feat, you don't have to choose another feat that would have been available to you at the time that you got that feat. You just change out any of your feats at the time that you're casting the spell. So since you're already level 19 or higher, you could potentially choose another epic boon. Again, you are risking the ability to ever cast Wish again if you land on that 33% chance to lose Wish for using it for a purpose other than casting a spell of 8th level or lower. So the average class has, 4 feats other than their epic boon that they get at 19th level. So that is a 33% chance to fail each time, which is about an 80% chance to fail at least once, or like 81, something like that. I mean, if you want to run that risk, you certainly can, but it might be worth trying at least once to get 2 epic boons, depending on how important some of those other feats are to you. Notably, this would also affect an ability score increase because the ability score increase is a feat in 2024. You could also replace your origin feat this way as well. And again, even though you have to roll to see if you land on that 33% chance, remember that the heroic inspiration allows you to re-roll any roll that you do. It could be a damage roll, it could be an attack roll, it could be a wild magic surge roll, or it could be the roll to determine whether or not you lose the ability to cast Wish. Now, of course, here it doesn't say specifically that 33% chance is a roll. It doesn't necessarily say that you roll that, but it just kind of depends on whether or not your DM is letting you be the one to decide that, and if that is decided by a roll on the percentile dice. So that is the end of all of this. That is every spell change in the 2024 Player's Handbook for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. It was quite a long ride. It was quite a lot of work to put all this together, so I hope you guys appreciated it. And again, I'll have all these spell change videos in a playlist down below, as well as available on my channel page, of course. Let me know what you think about any of the spells mentioned in this video down in the comments. If there are any sort of cool interactions that are possible now because of some of these spells, much like being able to switch out your older feats for epic boons once you're level 19 or 20 with Wish. I'd be interested to know all that down in the comments down below. And again, while you're going down to the comments, please hit that like button. If you are a new viewer to this channel or a returning viewer and you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider hitting that subscribe button now. I release videos every Wednesday and Sunday, so you always have something to look forward to. I'm not quite sure what video is coming next. I have had a couple ideas as I've been working on these spell change videos that I want to work on, so I'll definitely have something coming down the pipelines. But I appreciate all your guys' time, and I'll see you in the next one.